Hi, everyone, and welcome to our joint Northwest RISC and Oregon Invasive Species Council webinar, Spreading Information, Not Invasives, Amplifying Climate Change and First Foods Considerations in an Invasive Species Sharing Hub. My name is Emily Fusco, and I am the Northwest RISC Network Coordinator, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Feel free to ask any questions using the Zoom chat feature at any time. I'll keep track of the questions as we go, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time to answer these questions during a Q&A session. All right, so I'd like to introduce to you all Kat De Rivera. Kat is a professor of environmental science and management at Portland State University, where she researches and teaches about biological invasions. She's an active member of the Oregon Invasive Species Council and part of their working group that has been creating a digital information hub about invasive species threats to Oregon. She has also been serving as the lead for a grant from the Western IPM to expand this information hub to highlight the intersection between invasive species and first foods, as well as climate change. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kat. And Kat, whenever you are ready, you can take it away.
Great. Many thanks, Emily, for the intro, and especially to you and Northwest RISC for hosting the webinar. So since its start, the Oregon Invasive Species Council, OISC here, has had a 100 worst invaders list, but we recently created a website to replace that list so the information can be up to date, searchable, have maps, etc. We call it the Invasive Species Information Hub. And then we received a grant from the Western IPM to do a pilot expansion of the hub to include information about first foods and climate change and their intersection with invaders. And the work, and Alex, would you advance? The work for this grant was largely conducted by our team of presenters here, each of whom will share with you highlights of their work. And introducing them here in the order we'll present, our team includes me, but I'm not going to say much. Alex Staunch from the Mosaic Ecology and the Oregon Invasive Species Council, Fiona Smeaton from Samara Group, Cheryl Shippentauer from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and also part of the Oregon Invasive Species Council, and as was Alex, and Rachel Gregg from the Environmental Science Associates, and also the Northwest RISC. And so, and you can advance again, Alex. And so our goals of this webinar are to let you know about the hub in general as a place to go to get up-to-date information for invasive species, and including documents and maps on them, et cetera, and especially to highlight the intersection between first foods and invasions, as well as climate change and invasions. And so this is just an outline of what we'll talk about today, an introduction to the Digital Information Hub that Alex will do, our survey results that Fiona will present, the intersection between first foods and invasive species, which Cheryl is our specialist there, and the intersection between climate change and invasive species, and Rachel's our specialist there. And then we'll go back to Alex for the hub goals and components, including alerts and things like that, and showcasing an example species for first foods and another one for climate change. So without further ado, Alex, will you kick it off talking about the hub?
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Kat. So as Kat stated, there was a big need for the Invasive Species Digital Information Hub, a dynamic and updatable database that replaced the Oregon's Worst Invaders list. The Oregon's Worst Invaders list, or top 100, which then expanded well past 100, originally was portrayed in a table, an Excel format, which is great, but it's static, it's non-interactive. Updates take a little bit longer. So the hope was to create something on the web that can be accessed by others and interacted with. So I'll provide a more interactive tour of the hub at the end and show you some of its components and features. But it is a link on the Oregon Invasive Species Council's website, which we'll click on, and I'll show you exactly how to access that. But with all the species profiles here, where we're able to add well over 100 species, currently we have 107 published with about 40 more waiting for final edits to be put up. But you're able to search by taxa as well as other features and be able to focus on the information you want. So there is a utilitarian component. I work for a natural resource management company where we have crews that we send out to different areas to conduct different tasks. So being able to see what species or where or what their possible risks are is very useful for myself being a project manager. And here's an example of our grid view where I was able to quickly search of the 107 published species, ecoregion suitability. So I selected the ecoregions east of the Cascades, and then was able to select if any of them were potentially impacted by climate change. And I'll expand on this, and you'll be able to read these attributes a little bit better. But being able to identify 8 species of various taxa that are potentially impactful east of the Cascades, and how they could potentially react to climate change is important, and it can easily be filtered by this database. And if you're able to, so if you select these species and you're to click on them, like the rough here, we are able to see a plethora of information, everything from species descriptions, how to ID them, to documents that are attached from managing agencies, lookalikes, and a lot of different information that could be useful to a large audience. So in saying that, yeah, this is what the hub is at 1,000-foot view, but I'll pass it off to Fiona and we can discuss the additions that the IPM grant brought on.
Great. Thank you, Alex. All right. So yeah, as Kat mentioned in her introduction, as part of the Western IPM grant, we surveyed stakeholders to get a better idea of how to incorporate first foods and climate change into the info hub and find ways to make it the most helpful and informative to the user. So the grant team put together an online survey. Next slide, please. Thank you. With the goal of understanding the link between invasive species and these 2 factors, first foods and climate change. We wanted to know from the people we surveyed if these topics play a part in their management decisions, and if they do, how are they currently finding the information that they need, and where do they feel that they are having difficulty finding resources. So the survey was sent out in November of 2022, and we had a pretty good response rate, a total of 108 complete responses from professionals in various roles. And we wanted to understand the interest of these 2 topics before getting into more species-specific information and different management strategies. So this shows that there certainly was a high amount of concern from the total number of participants about first foods and invasive species, which led us to believe that it would be a valuable addition to the hub. Next slide, please. Same was true for climate change and invasive species. About 63% of survey respondents noted that they are very concerned about the effect climate change will have or is currently having on invasive species management. And now again, the goal was to identify this concern and find ways that the online info hub could fill in the gaps or help to compile relevant information. So we asked the participants a bit more about their position, where they worked and how they currently look for information on this subject. So in terms of who we heard from, we did hear from individuals across 15 different agencies and organizations, and the majority of the respondents were from the Willamette Valley region, though we did hear from others in the Oregon coast, Washington, as well as a couple from California, Idaho, and BC. Next slide. Thank you. So to follow the cause and effect of respondent strategies, we asked what everyone's top management priorities are, and then what resources and decision-making tools do they use to address these priorities. So on the left, this shows the 5 most popular management priorities across all of the responses. Definitely not the only priorities, but kind of a snapshot of what most everyone is focused on. So we have biodiversity ranked highest, followed by habitat connectivity, threatened and endangered species, and habitats, as well as freshwater resources. And then to the right, we have the top 5 decision-making tools where participants were asked, what kind of information do you currently use to make decisions on invasive species? These were the 5 most common selections. So we definitely heard that peer knowledge is incredibly valuable, as well as best practices, literature, and in-field observations and conversations. Next slide, please. So in order to start to incorporate resources about first foods and climate change on the hub, the grant team put together an extensive list of high-level threat invasives that could be part of our pilot program here. So in the survey, participants were asked to rank a large list of species of highest concern in terms of climate change and first foods. And this is that prioritized list. So this is what we're starting with for this pilot expansion. And of course, this is not a comprehensive list. The goal is to add this information throughout the entire hub eventually, but this is kind of our starting point. Next slide, please. So at the end of the survey, we asked if participants would be willing to be contacted for a follow-up conversation so that we could dive into this topic a little deeper. And it was a smaller sample size, but we did hear back from folks who had more that they wanted to share with us. And so we sent out these 5 questions, and we had some email responses as well as a couple of small group follow-up interviews over Zoom. And I won't read through all of these, but basically the first 2 questions were focused again on the links between invasive species with climate change and first foods. And then the last 3 focused on resources currently being used and ways in which the hub could be useful in housing those resources and filling in the gaps. Next slide. So what we heard from those interviews in terms of first foods, interviewees noted that they currently do not have enough information, enough knowledge about first foods. This is something where information varies greatly depending on the tribes and the specific environments. There was also the acknowledgement that this can be sensitive information and some tribes may not want to reveal specifics about populations and locations. In terms of the information that we do have, interviewees are definitely interested to see more info provided about invasive species that share similar habitat requirements with first foods and how that might be further impacted by climate change. And there was also the request to consider the impacts of invasive species management on first foods, especially chemical management. Pesticide residuals is of major concern in terms of first foods. And then it was recommended that in addition to having information on each species profile, that we create a page on the OISC website that highlights this information, including case studies from tribal nations that have had successful outcomes and details the kind of management processes that they went through to protect first foods. Then in terms of climate change, there was discussion about wanting to expand the alert system for species that we should be especially concerned about, having a way to get information about their current spatial distribution and which species are clearly on the move. Interviewees requested some sort of predictive tool that alerts managers about invasives that would be likely to thrive in a warming climate. So for example, models of different climate scenarios. And while the hub wouldn't actually create those models or materials, there might be an opportunity for us to plug into existing monitoring efforts for certain species and link to that within the hub. And there was also discussion about having a more general web page, just as with first foods, that discusses the concept of how climate change increases invasive species. And while it's good to have the species-specific information, we also want to make sure that we are communicating the fact that almost all species will have some kind of impact, and climate change doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there will inevitably be many new unforeseen impacts that come from invasive species. So we wrote up a report that has many more details on the survey. So anyone who is interested in reading the full report, please feel free to contact me. My email was on that previous slide, but it'll be at the end too. So yeah, feel free to contact me if you'd like to see more details on that report. There's definitely more specific recommendations as well as more general feedback as well. But with that, I will go ahead and stop and pass it off to Cheryl.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, good morning. I'm going to talk about first foods and invasive species. So next page, please. First of all, I want to talk about first foods and invasive species. They threaten first foods that are essential to maintain and enhance the tribal traditions and culture, cause dramatic changes to ecosystems by shifting first food species composition, species mortality, biodiversity, and disturbance regimes. Also decrease and eliminate tribal access to these culturally important foods, medicines, and other uses. Okay, next slide. I first wanted to give a kind of a quick overview of first foods. First foods are traditional foods gathered by tribes, and I'll specifically talk about what's gathered by the Umatilla tribes and other tribes within the plateau area. So first is water or choosh. This is a first food and it's important for all the rest of the first foods. And so the next one is salmon or nasuk. This includes all the aquatic species, so salmon, lamprey, freshwater mussels, resident fish as well. And then we go into deer or yamash is our big game. So this includes ungulates, deer, elk, bighorn sheep, mountain goats. And then those are what we call our mince foods, or what we call our brothers. And then we go into the women's food, which is couch. And these are all greens, roots that are gathered by the tribe. And then finally, we have huckleberry. We knew this covers all berry crops or plants that are picked. And then these are based on our creation story, that these foods stepped up and presented themselves in this order. And so we remember these foods every year, and every ceremony or Sunday feast, that these foods are placed on a table in this order. They're gathered in this order. Specifically the women's foods, we gather them in the order that they presented themselves to us. So next slide. And so this is a list of the first food and farm species profiles, and they're organized based on, so like the first few species impact aquatic species, so they'll impact salmonids, freshwater mussels. Then you move down to the chronic wasting disease, where they'll impact wildlife, and that not only impacts us hunting and living off those, but it also affects the materials that are what we gather from those animals, their hides for ceremonial dress, our regalia, drums. A lot of tribal members use other parts of the elk, and if they're impacted with this chronic waste, we can no longer use those. And tribals are already seeing impacts from that. And then move down to the vegetation, where they impact, upland species that are important to us. And then they also impact our berry crops as well in our forested areas. Okay, next slide. I guess I wanted to also talk about with those species and forms, there'll be links to case studies or links to why those foods are important to us and what tribes are doing to help control those. And so I kind of wanted to talk specifically about feral swine, and because it impacts all the foods. Their rooting, wallowing, trampling, their feeding behaviors will definitely have the potential to affect first foods. So the first one, like water, that's important for all the other first foods. So with their rooting and wallowing in wetlands or stream sides, they'll alter the water quality of the streams, and then that'll impact our salmon species or our aquatic species. They also alter riparian vegetation, so they'll remove native vegetation, allowing invasive species to come in there and invade those, for example, like Japanese knotweed. And then they also impact wildlife, predation. They do a lot of damage to habitat. They change those habitats and create destruction in those plant communities that wildlife depend on. And then the next one, cows, where the root crops, with this the rooting and wallowing, they can impact camas. They like to be in wet areas. Also, we gather a lot of roots and greens. Excuse me. It'll change those compositions, and we'll lose access to those foods. And so they also can impact shrubs that bear, like for huckleberries, they reduce and remove forest understory and vegetation, and that could impact our berry crops for huckleberries. Also, any kind of medicinal we gather in those forested areas. Okay, go ahead, next slide. So first food and invasive management is important, but it also increases our chance, specifically with herbicide application or pesticide application. It'll impact the foods that we gather. We gather like the first foods, and we're out, fishing in our streams and tributaries of the Columbia River. We go to Montana and hunt buffalo. We hunt deer and elk, bighorn sheep. But it also impacts the foods that we gather in the upland areas and the forested areas. Any of those residuals, it increases our exposure. And it's not just those, but also the materials that we gather. We gather a variety of habitats and different materials for our basketry. We gather for medicinal purposes, spiritual, and all these are either we ingest or we handle them, we put our foods in them. So it's just that increased exposure to herbicides that we're need to be cautious about when we're gathering first foods and the invasive management of invasive species. Okay, go ahead, next slide. And so, and it's important, we have invasive management plans. We have the Umatilla River Vision, as well as the First Foot Upland Vision, that addresses the ecological processes that are important to enhance, restore, maintain those first foods. And part of that is invasive species management. There's a vegetation component in both of these guiding documents that help us manage with the tribe, but this also is available for other land managers to use to address invasive species, to restoration work. They're really useful, and they'll be available as links within the hub or within our website. And other tribes have management plans, as well as similar mission statements. Our first food mission, that's how we manage our resources. But I think it's important to build partnerships with tribes within your homeland, to learn more about first foods, to learn how we address our natural management approach, and just that coordination with tribes to work together on controlling invasive species, not only for the tribes, but for the general public and for the state of Oregon or the Pacific Northwest. It's really important that we do a collaboration with this. And also that, within our homelands, building that relationship so that tribal members are aware of where these treatments are going on, so we can avoid those areas while those areas are being restored. And I think that's just the key point, is collaboration and partnerships with tribes and other land managers. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl.
And the next is Rachel, and she'll talk about climate change and invasive species.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. So you can move to the next slide, Alex. Just to chat through, go back a little bit higher level, we acknowledge that invasive species are a really long-standing challenge in the Pacific Northwest. So these are species that can cause native species declines through predation, disease, habitat alteration, and then also competition for resources like food and light. They can also have genetic effects on closely related local populations through hybridization or by genetically outcompeting native species. Invasives also act as disease vectors for humans and can negatively affect both the productivity and then also the operations of really important sectors in the region, such as agriculture, fisheries, tourism and recreation, and then our energy and water utilities. And all of these challenges will be magnified by the impacts of climate change and really complicate the business as usual approach to natural resources management that we have. So for example, warming temperatures can bring new pest areas, but also simultaneously stress trees so that they're more susceptible to pest outbreaks, and then consequently affect the ability of forests to effectively recover from pest disturbance. Next slide. So changes such as warming air and water temperatures and precipitation changes can cause rain shifts or different and more suitable temperature and moisture regimes for both non-native and invasive species. Rain shifts will also lead to species moving out of their current distribution or becoming rarer. This creates some of that ecological space for other species to increase in abundance and become invasive, or for non-native invasive species to move in. Wildfires, droughts, and other disturbance events can degrade or destroy those forest, shrub, grassland habitats, allowing invasive annual grasses such as cheatgrass, which I'm sure everybody's heard about, to really come in and quickly replace and outcompete native species. And species that have the potential to become invasive tend to have very high growth rates, rapid growth rates, high reproductive rates and capabilities, very short generation times, really wide environmental tolerances, and pretty good dispersal abilities. All of those are criteria that are pretty rich for invasions, and all of which will be aided by warming temperatures and increasing carbon dioxide levels. Invasive species can also exacerbate the impacts of climate change. So for example, emerald ash borer invasions can reduce riparian canopy cover, which provides that critical shade to moderate warming stream temperatures, which helps to protect salmonids in a changing climate. And then of course, there's lots of unknowns that still remain in terms of how climate change will play out and what the on-the-ground consequences are for native species, but also non-native and invasive species. There are some big scale changes that we're still unsure about, like the melting of the sea ice in the Northwest Passage, that may facilitate new opportunities for invasive aquatic species to be introduced via maritime transportation pathways. So there's still some research that needs to be done. Next slide. So we selected a number of species to review in greater detail. Several of these were prioritized in both the Northwest RISC survey from late 2020 and the more recent targeted survey for this project that Fiona described earlier. So this list here includes a range of plants, animals, and pathogens, both those that are currently found in the Pacific Northwest and those that are likely to expand their ranges due to climate change or other factors. We worked with some students from Portland State University to review relevant literature and any best available science to create some climate-informed species profiles that are going to be added to the hub. Next slide. So the profiles follow this format where we tried to review the impacts of climate change on the species at hand, any relevant management implications, particularly those related to climate-related stressors, and any relevant research needs and knowledge gaps. And then as Cheryl was talking about, we tried to make links to first foods to explain those wherever possible as well. So to provide a quick example, I want to chat through the emerald ash borer, which is a highly invasive and destructive insect. It was first discovered in Forest Grove, Oregon in June 2022, which I believe this is correct. It was the first recorded appearance west of the Rockies. This particular insect and invasion poses a pretty significant threat to the ash species that comprise a lot of the riparian habitats here in the Pacific Northwest. Increasing temperatures can facilitate its range expansion, and studies show that warmer winters will likely drive the insect northward, increasing stress on stands of ash trees in northern regions that have not been previously exposed. And warming temperatures and increased drought stress on host ash species may make them more susceptible to those emerald ash borer infestations. However, increases in the unpredictable or cold snaps or some of those more extreme temperature fluctuations in between seasons could actually curtail emerald ash borer range expansion and infestation of ash stands. When we were looking at management strategies, current management strategies for emerald ash borer include things like removing and quarantining infected ash stands, nursery stock, firewood, timber, attracting the borer for destruction in certain areas, and also the use of biological or biocontrol agents. One way that climate change may actually shift some of these management strategies is that warmer winters could actually increase the viability of a lot of the biocontrol agents. Currently, they cannot survive temperatures as low as emerald ash borer does. So that could be an interesting change. So when we're looking across all of the species we reviewed for this project in terms of management implications and needs, a lot of the current techniques that are currently being used are going to be more important than ever. Some may have to be modified to better reduce vulnerability to both invasives and climate change. And this will primarily be changes in things like the timing, the frequency, the intensity, or the combination of activities when you're thinking about things like chemical, biological, manual, mechanical controls. So for example, weeding or chemical applications may need to actually move earlier in the spring to adjust to shorter winters and earlier spring blooms of species. And a lot of focus that we found, on these species in a changing climate is really on improving those monitoring programs to better track the spread of invasives, to come up with that rapid detection models, and also provide early warning signals for managers, but also to track the effectiveness of management measures. That's one big piece of uncertainty, is knowing, I'm sure some of you on the call with that say some of our current management measures are not that effective. So thinking through how are those things going to be effective or not effective in a changing climate, and what are some new strategies we could test out and apply and see how they work. In terms of research needs, a lot more needs to be explored with respect to Northwest specific conditions. Many of the studies found are from other regions. So part of this need for new and improved research includes that effectiveness tracking of different strategies. So this was a pretty solid start for us at integrating climate change impacts and associated management implications and research needs into the kind of standard hub species profiles. And we see a lot of opportunity to expand on this work across all species that are included in the hub. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alex for a tour.
Yeah, hello, thank you. So my hope is to provide an overview of the hub working group, as well as a brief tour through the hub itself online, to show folks the features and capacities of this tool. So I'm trying to manage this and talk at the same time. Apologies. So the hub working group is the real engine behind the hub itself. It's composed of OISC members, about 15 individuals, as well as taxonomic experts. And I think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't mention Jaylene Littlejohn, the former coordinator of the council, is really the person that pushed this database and provided a lot of energy into creating this and got it off the ground. But the hub working group meets regularly to form structure and guide the hub. We have quarterly meetings, and we also invite taxonomic experts at times to see if they could provide input on the species that we were posting. And we do work with the researchers or agency heads or just species experts throughout the state and region to provide input on these species and ensure that everything is up to date and accurate. We also want it to be a collaborative effort. So folks that are on this call are able to provide input in an organized manner through a tab on the hub itself, where a list comes up and you're able to put in information of whether it be mistakes, possible additions, or just general input to this database. So I'm going to click on the link below to get us into the hub and provide a general hub overview of the specific components, the difference between gallery and grid views, kind of have a painstakingly detailed review of the content within, as well as IPM additions, the additions from this grant that were added that have to do with first foods and climate change. And the filtering function, which allows lists and other data to be extracted that the land manager or informed citizen is looking into. So here's the hub itself, and I hope everyone can see this. I'm not really monitoring the chats, but we can first off stop in at our well-made and well-organized Invasive Species Council website, where it can be navigated by going to the Invasive Species tab, as well as this link right here in the front of the page. So this is the landing page, where we'll also provide links to climate change and first foods pages that stand by themselves. But if you were to scroll down here, we have our alert species, where these are species that are of importance. They're the new discoveries to the state of Oregon or in the surrounding area, and or maybe a season in which the impacts of these species are particularly bad. But we have right now one active alert, and we try not to overuse this. We try to have it only be for those that are the most important species to highlight at that time. They are meant to exist for only 3-month periods. But right now, what has been active for a little over or almost a year is the emerald ash borer alert. And this provides updates of what agencies are doing, as well as best practices or what you can do. So if you open this up, we provide the alert description that provides some background on this sighting, photos, as well as attachments that can be used in identification or just general education, and most importantly, call to action, how land managers as well as informed individuals of the public can make a difference and what can they do. And we don't reinvent the wheel, in which we try to have folks access pages that exist already. For example, we have the primary web link. It just happens to be another page on the council's website that is EAB oriented, and the Oregon Invasive Species Council has taken a big role in communication and education in that front. But we also have news and press, and a distribution map that's up to date for this species in particular. And in the past year, or since this has been active, we've had 2 alerts present that we've kept up here in previous to help track this. One being the elongate hemlock scale, when it was discovered in shipments of wreaths into Oregon, as well as last May, or May of 2022, the viral crayfish, which was first discovered in the state. So those were put up to help guide the general public and provide input. And if you keep going down here, we have species to look out for in Oregon, and this is where we hit species overviews. And it's organized in this attractive taxonomic grouping. And if you're interested in seeing what crustaceans are either within Oregon or potentially suitable and we should keep an eye out for, you can click this, and then fish as well. And it's organized in this taxa specific grouping. And if we were to go ahead and filter and look for, as we just discussed, species that could potentially have be impacted by climate change, we're able to select that. It's very simple too. Potential impacts of climate change are simple checkbox or not. And we can go ahead and look at the species profile of the green crab. And here we have general information, that being the species description. This is usually geared towards how to identify the species, certain photos that are pertinent, and then different filtering categories that are in here that helps with groupings. And economic impacts, human health impacts, causes diseases, ecological impacts. These are all important to policymakers, land managers, agency heads. And what I think is most useful, and not all species have these, we're working to propagate it, but the lookalikes. So we've been able to use products or deliverables created by other agencies or organizations and implement them here to act as a all-comprehensive resource of all the different resources out there. The impacts distribution map for where it may be, and then attachments for additional resources, which could be management plans, or here's the invasive species primer for Oregon policymakers, because that species is included in there. And then here, right at the end, and we're working to organize this, but these are the features that were included in the hub due to this grant, where we're able to filter out which species, or identify which species are impacted by climate change, which species have impacts on first foods, the sector relevance they may have, and then the impacts of climate change on these species, and further descriptions of the impacts on first foods. And what was additionally added was management implications and strategies, along with research needs. So we're trying to expand upon this, and we'll take these features and add them to other species as well as time goes on. And besides being in the gallery format there, we have ourselves at grid format with all 107 published species present, in which the hope for this is that it's more easy to filter this out. So for myself, as again, managing crews that go out in the field, I'd like to possibly let them know what plants to look out for. So say we were working in Multnomah County, we look for those that we can easily search the species that are currently infested in or currently present in Multnomah County. And then I can go ahead and look up the taxa group of being plants. And I'll get that list. There's about 8 of them, and it can be downloaded into a CSV file and be sent out with the crews in the field. So the hope is that this database, the hub, becomes a resource that can be used by others within the state and beyond, and help organize this information, all of it that is out there accordingly. And as I stated earlier, the OISC's Information Hub is a collaborative effort, so please feel free to provide any proposed edits and input that you may have. And it's read by members of the working group and implemented in our next working session. So that is it from me, and I can go ahead and pass it back, I believe, to Kat.
All right, well, thank you all. Actually, the slide before this, please.
Yeah, gotcha.
All right. So thanks for all for joining us, and we'll answer questions in a moment. But first, I just wanted to also thank the Western IPM Center for funding to expand what we've started for the Information Hub to First Foods and Climate Change. Thanks to Northwest RISC for hosting the webinar. to ODA, who serves as our fiscal agent. Troy Abercrombie and Jolene Littlejohn wrote the original proposal along with Cheryl and Rachel. And Patrick Singh and Hugh Addy of the Public Affairs Council set up and distributed the survey. And Marie Hepner from Samara Group has really helped a lot throughout as well. And thanks all of you for taking the survey who did and for joining now. And we can look at questions, I believe. And I put, if you advance to the next slide, Alex, I put our emails there. If you have any further questions in the future or want to follow up on anything. So some of you have already put questions.
Yes.
Go ahead, Emily.
Yes, there are already some questions in the chat ready for you all. So thank you so much for this presentation. That was really great. It was great to hear about all this work that you all have been doing. So we can jump right into some questions. So the first one that I saw here is asking if you all could talk a little bit more about the availability of information that can be used in research, and if there's any classification of the degree of confidence in reported records of invasive species. This person also asked if users could get access to geographic locations of records of invasive species.
Alex, do you want to start with that answer?
Yes. So when it comes to geographic records, we provide that there are distribution lists on the or sections that have the distributions within each species overview. And we just recently incorporated IMAP invasives into this and tried to get as many of those maps in there that align with the species. So that's one example. And so I was fiddling around with the management end here and I missed the first part of that question, but what was that?
The first part of the question is about the availability of this information to be used in research.
I guess that's a question for the group. So I hopped on as a co-chair, but I believe this can be, it's primarily links to primary sources or other sections that can be cited. And that's the hope. So if there is facts or research on there that you would like to incorporate into research, let us know and we can find out ways to link them more appropriately to where we got that information. Because again, the hub is meant to take the information that is out there and not necessarily create it on our own. So I hope that answered your question.
Great,
Yeah,
thank
I
you
was
so
gonna
much.
say, if I'm understanding right, what we did for the climate change sections of the profiles was tried to be really clear about what references we found. So we, tried to link directly to primary literature, on the ground experiments, on the ground sightings, and include all of those references in the species profile so that hopefully people would be able to find that primary literature.
Right. So we have another question here asking about they're interested in more information about tribal concerns for invasive annual grass treatments like imazapic or indaziflam within areas containing first food. So Cheryl, I think this was something you were talking about, if you could expand on that at all.
Yes. Yeah, those chemicals are new and the tribes are concerned about, I guess I should back up a little bit. We are definitely concerned about invasive grasses impacting first foods. And we've seen, our gatherers have seen those areas being overtaken by annual grasses. But we're also concerned about, because those new chemicals, they are residual in the soil. And so we have been, we've outreach to Enview, who is the distributor of those two chemicals, and to ask, do they have research? Is there research available of those impacts on naturally occurring plants? And so we're hoping we've requested what they call IR4 project. Well, they'll study and see if there's any kind of human health impacts from those chemicals, but we also are also concerned about because those soil residual can last 2 to 5 years. So we're also concerned about impacts to the first foods. Will that impact the recruitment of those species? But we're definitely, and we also want to be informed in those areas that they're being applied on public lands or areas that we have access to, so that we can avoid those areas. I think that NViews also working with EPA to add that to the label to avoid areas for at least 2 years, but with the residual, could be potentially 5 years. So that is a concern for us, but we are interested in controlling annual grasses and using those to help, protect first foods as well, and habitat for wildlife and the gathering of those foods that grow in those rangeland areas.
Great, thanks so much. So we have another question here about, this is also directed for you, Cheryl. They're curious if indigenous first food gatherers utilize non-native species for medicines.
I believe so. I think there's tribal members who utilize other plants, that if they're familiar with those, I think that they're out there gathering those as well. Because I think a lot of tribal nations, when these plants were introduced, they found uses for them. So I think that still continues today.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We do have a few folks asking again for the link to the Hub webpage. So Alex, if you are able to put that in the chat for everyone, I think they would like to have access to that. We've got a lot of folks very excited about accessing this information. Let's see. So we have another question here about the survey itself. So this person is asking if you could expand on and share a bit more about the sample, your survey sample. So who the respondents were in a general sense, how you all identified folks to survey, and how you contacted them.
Yeah, Kat, you might be the best one to answer that question.
We, the Northwest RISC helped and distributed the survey, and we also had a survey distribution to the Oregon Invasive Species, not only the council, but our network, which includes people who have just let us know they're interested in that. And then it snowballed from that with people, recipients of those lists passing it on. So that was a sample size, or that was the distribution. Sample size I can dig up, but do you know it off the top of your head, Fiona?
No, I don't have that off the top of my head. Yeah, I can say from the full group of who we followed up with, that was just self-selection. So anyone who took the survey, they were selected at the end if they would like to be followed up for a more detailed follow-up interview. So that's where we talked in more detail about climate change and first foods.
Great, thanks. Anyone else wants to add to that?
I'm trying to find the question again because there were multiple parts there, and I feel like we didn't touch on all of them.
Oh, yeah, it was just about the, how you all identified and contacted your survey respondents, and then just information about kind of like that demographics, like the sample size and who those respondents were.
All right, I'm going to look up some of that and then maybe get back to that question.
Sure, that sounds great. So we have another question here for Cheryl about, this person wants to know, what are some ways that youth in your tribe are learning about stressor impacts on first foods? And they're asking specifically about, if there are any kinds of education programs about this, that you view as important for developing further or for more funding?
Well, I don't know if I think that that's shared. Well, we start, I guess I'm trying to answer the question very good. I guess there's a lot of education that goes with gathering out these resources. And I think that is shared with when they're out there gathering on the landscape, that there's these stressors that are impacting, their climate change is one. We have a youth council that's really active. They address natural resource issues. We also have like a annual, what we call the Children's Feast. And so they're out there gathering, whether it's with their family or with this organized event. And I think that that information is shared with them as well. And I'm not sure about the funding issue, but I mean, we're always looking for funding to do like outreach so for people who haven't had experience with gathering these first foods, that they have opportunity and they know areas to go and gather and how to process those foods. And I think it's important that we address those. And I think we're having a forum soon that'll bring in the gatherers and they can share their concerns, whether it's climate change issues or the way land management is occurring, or what kind of things they're seeing out there while they're gathering. So we'll be able to use that information for our management efforts as well.
Great, thanks so much. All right, well, so we have just about a minute left here. I wanted to open this back up to the panelists to see if you all have, just any final thoughts that you would like to share with our group before we close out our webinar today.
Well, for me, one of the big things is this is meant to be not static, but always improving and being added to, et cetera, and that you all can be, if you would like to be part of that, by making suggestions, by if you see a species, by reporting that, and by reviewing species documents, et cetera. So it's going to be a long-term continual project, essentially. So it should be live and usable, but also, and we have lots of expansion to do. This is a pilot for the climate change and first food species. What I'm seeing here is it's being well received, and we should continue in the survey also. Let us know that.